Into a nuclear war, we are learning more about the worldview of some of the people who staff his government at the very highest levels. And it is not reassuring. Foreign Policy magazine published a memo entitled POTUS and Political Warfare, written by a now former National Security Council staffer named Rich Higgins, who says things like this.
Anybody who's spent time in the Middle East will recognize this. Critical thinking and reason do not exist in the Middle East as we understand them here.
Higgins' NSC memo reflects not the sober analysis you might expect from someone tasked with defending the country, but rather the sort of paranoid worldview of a conspiracy theorist. He weaves together a vast array of alleged enemies of the president that he calls cultural Marxists, a group that includes deep state actors, globalists, bankers, Islamists, and establishment Republicans who are engaged in political warfare to destroy both the president and the nation as we know it. The memo, somewhat reassuringly, got Higgins fired after it was discovered by National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, who had reportedly been trying to root out whoever it was leaking to an anti-McMaster alt-right blogger and Pizzagate conspiracy theorist. But before Higgins was dismissed, his memo made its way to Donald Trump Jr., who, Foreign Policy magazine reported, gave it to his dad. The president, and I quote the reporting here, who gushed over it, according to sources. Trump later learned from Sean Hannity, the Fox News host and close friend of the president, the memo's author had been fired. Trump was furious, the senior administration official said. He is still furious. Joshua Green has been covering the feud between McMaster and Steve Bannon for Bloomberg Businessweek as author of Devil's Bargain, Steve Bannon, Donald Trump, and the Storming of the Presidency. This memo is really, really something else. Did it surprise you when you read it?
Yeah, it did. You know, I read it 3 times, and my conclusion is that this is the product of a mind more fevered than Steve Bannon's. It is just bizarre and batty and disjointed. And while it does reflect, it does kind of hit some of the notes that I know Bannon believes in, the idea that the deep state and the media and the political establishments in both parties are trying to undermine or contain Donald Trump. It's just so weird and rambling that it doesn't really reflect the way that Bannon thinks and speaks. He has a lot of vices, but he's actually a very cogent thinker and writer. So it didn't sound like something that was the product of him. And
yet he is ensnared. I mean, the reason that he's sort of relevant here is this what appears to be this proxy war that's happening over the National Security Council with Bannon on one side and McMaster on the other. What is your understanding from your reporting about what is going on there?
Well, I mean, basically Bannon and McMaster represent 2 different factions in American foreign policy, and Bannon and the nationalists around him favor a less interventionist foreign policy with a focus on combating radical Islam in China, and McMaster is more of a traditional hawkish foreign policy guy who wants to be more aggressive in places like Syria and Afghanistan and North Korea. And the reason it's such a bitter ideological dispute, I think, is that Bannon feels like McMaster represents what the nationalist faction calls the war party. And so on every issue that's come up before the administration, whether a foreign policy issue, whether it's Afghanistan or Syria or now North Korea, they just have distinctly different viewpoints. And Bannon is not a guy who likes to kind of fall back and defer to other people. And even though he's been kicked off the National Security Council, he obviously still has a voice in the administration's foreign policy and is trying to exert his influence through other channels.
We should be clear that to the extent there's a war party, the other side, the Bannon side, for instance, on Afghanistan, wants to essentially outsource the conflict to 5,000 mercenaries by Eric Prince. So it's not exactly like there's like a big peace faction on the other side.
Yeah, I mean, Bannon's view, to the extent that I understand it, is that he wants U.S. troops out of Afghanistan. He wants to wind down the U.S. military presence, and along with Jared Kushner, sounds like had come up with a slightly crazy-sounding plan to essentially send mercenaries in their place. So it isn't that Bannon is a pacifist by any means, but he wants to scale back American military involvement in most places.
And you've got this remarkably bizarre situation. So McMaster's trying to sort through the NSC and find people like this. You've got the author of this memo who's been fired. It makes you wonder who else is there. Meanwhile, in the showdown with Bannon, the Breitbart publication that he used to run is waging this absolutely merciless ideological warfare against the president's national security advisor. Day after day, Zionist Organization of America analysis determines McMaster hostile to Trump, calls for reassignment. You've got McMaster leaks. You've got cartoons circulating the internet and the alt-right fringe that are sympathetic to Bannon of McMaster as a puppet of George Soros. I mean, this is really bizarre.
It is, but I think that, Breitbart sees itself as part of this nationalist faction trying to stand up for their guy in the White House and trying to push back against, the quote-unquote globalists like McMaster, who are doing things like not repealing the Iran nuclear deal, as Trump had promised to do when he got elected president, and essentially luring Trump away from his true nationalist populist impulses, which he gave air to during the campaign. And so I think, at least on the Breitbart side, and this may be true on the McMaster side too, it really is a kind of struggle for the soul of the Trump presidency.
All right, fascinating insights, Josh Green. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Coming up, how a hotel short on guests is still flush with cash. Here's a hint. It has the president's name on it. That after the break.
Cosequin is proud to support therapy dogs everywhere, like Smiley. Even though he was born without eyes, nothing's gonna slow him down, so he can keep spreading smiles.
That's why we trust Cosequin to keep Smiley's joints moving.
Cosequin, the #1 veterinarian recommended retail joint health supplement brand. While other brands compare themselves to Cosequin,
Only Cosequin is Cosequin.
keep them smiling from early years to golden years with Cosequin.
Home is where we kick off our shoes. But when family members forget, trust Angie's List to help. Visit angieslist.com today.
It's just a burst pipe. I can fix it.
No.
With Claim Rate Guard, your rates won't go up just because of a claim.
I totally could have.
No.
Switching to Allstate is worth it.
Andy Cohen can get anyone to spill their secrets.
It's a gift. How's the soup?
Tastes like hot garbage.
Is this a line from Will Call?
I've been poisoning my bones. I don't remember my date's name. I'm bald!
Even celebrities spill it all on Watch What Happens Live with Andy Cohen every Sunday through Thursday night at 11, only on Bravo.
The Trump International Hotel is raking it in. Despite expectations it would lose money in the first 4 months of the year, the hotel instead made a $2 million profit. The Washington Post reporting the $4.1 million swing from projected losses to profitability represents a 192% improvement over what the Trump family planned to make when the company opened the hotel in Washington, D.C. in the fall. But that doesn't mean the hotel is booked solid, quite the opposite. In fact, according to the Wall Street Journal, the Trump International has an occupancy rate of 44.4%, well below the 69.5% of comparable hotels. Instead, the hotel's profits this year largely came from two sources. The average room rate, which is nearly $165 more than comparable hotels, and the $8.2 million spent on food and drink so far at the hotel this year, which the Washington Post reports is 37.2% more than expected. Clearly, there's a disconnect here between price and demand, but the hotel offers something other D.C. properties don't: proximity to the president and the chance to put money in his pockets. The reporter who broke this story joins me next.
Hello, Discover Card.
Hi, can you tell me about these new Social Security alerts I keep hearing about?
Sure, just sign up online.
Just want to thank everybody for coming. We have had so many inquiries as to how we're doing at the old post office, what was formerly the old post office, and upstairs is almost complete. The rooms are almost complete. We have close to 300 rooms, super luxury, and it's going to be amazing.
President Trump's persistent hawking of his new D.C. hotel while he was on the campaign trail paid off big league. The Washington Post reporting that the hotel made $2 million profit in just 4 months. The reporter who broke that story for the Washington Post, Jonathan O'Connell, joins me now. Jonathan, how'd you get the data to get a sense of how the business is performing?
I just found it on the internet yesterday. The General Services Administration, which is the federal agency that leases that property to Mr. Trump's company, they posted 3 months worth of really detailed financial documents related to the hotel, and they also showed the performance from January through April. So it's the first real hard picture at the money that hotel's making.
And it seems to me from your article that there's a little bit of a gap in terms of what you would expect from the occupancy rate and what the actual numbers are. Explain that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Most hotels, successful hotels, have a great occupancy rate, meaning a lot of the rooms are rented, and then they're also strong in terms of how much they can charge per room. The Trump Hotel is very different from that, and it's a very unique kind of success financially, in that the rooms are only about 44% occupied, which is really low for among its competitors. But they're getting like $650 a night per room, which is way above the average, even when you compare it to hotels like the Hay Adams or the Four Seasons, other, very long-standing grand Washington hotels. People are willing to spend, for whatever reason, much more to stay in the Trump Hotel, at least they have so far this year.
So I guess the next question is, what's the for whatever reason? I mean, if it's one thing, if, people just want to stay, the thrill of staying in the hotel of the President of the United States, it's quite another if you have foreign governments or interests or lobby groups who are explicitly paying this premium because they want to curry favor. Do we know which it is?
We know some things. We obviously know that there are people. I mean, the hotel has become such a center of Republican politics in Washington. If you spend time there on any given weeknight, you could see a member of the cabinet, you could see somebody from Trump's inner circle, you could see someone from Trump's family there. There are interest groups who stay there and hold meetings there and spend a lot of money there. It's a place where if you want to be close to the Trump administration, it's a place to be. And we had a staffer in there run into the president of Romania at the hotel bar the day before he had a press conference with the president in the Rose Garden the next day. So there are people. I mean, I think that speaks to the fact that if people really want to stay at that hotel for whatever reason, but for maybe access to the president or to be close to Republican politics, they're willing to spend extra to do it.
The president of Romania anecdote is perfect, right? Because presumably that's a strategic decision undertaken by that foreign dignitary who wants to be able to say to the president the next day, "Hey, I was at your hotel," and get off on a good foot. But there are some critics who say that's actually a violation of the Emoluments Clause of the Constitution, or at least a sort of facial violation of a basic sense of quid pro quo.
Yeah, so that's where things get a little tricky from a legal perspective for Trump's company. The Emoluments Clause prevents, and has not been litigated in court anywhere, so it's hard to tell what it will really prevent practically, but it prevents any payments or benefits to the president from foreign governments. So the people running the hotel, the managers of the hotel, have specifically broken down their earnings into two different kind of ledgers. One ledger is the earnings from foreign governments, and the other ledger is everything else. And they're planning to donate the profits from at least the big ticket business from foreign governments to the U.S. Treasury at the end of the year. Now, I don't think that they're tracking every single foreign leader who maybe stays overnight or has, a coffee at the bar. So at some point, courts may decide whether that is a problem or not. The other thing is the fact that they can charge so much more than other hotels in Washington, sometimes $100 or $200 more above competitors, that could potentially be a problem also, because if it looks like it's above market rate, people may interpret that, or it could be interpreted legally as some sort of more like a gift than really a payment for a market service.
Right. You can get into trouble in campaign finance law, for instance, if you sell someone a house below market rate, or some, right? There are market transactions that if they deviate too far from what the market clearing rate is, the law, whether for tax purposes or campaign finance purposes, can interpret it as essentially a gift.
This hasn't been in the courts yet, and no courts have decided it, but anytime it looks a little squirrely in terms of not being, the going rate for something, it's just an opportunity for all these legal attacks on the president and his company. It just presents potentially an opening for them.
Excellent reporting from Jonathan O'Connell. Thanks so much for your insights.
I really appreciate it very much, Chris.
Ahead, while at his New Jersey golf club, the president has taken more questions from the press on camera than he has in months, from Putin to McConnell to Venezuela. We'll break it down with the panel ahead, and fighting for love in tonight's Thing 1, Thing 2 next.
Tomorrow's headlines before they go to print.
I've just been handed some great reporting.
Tomorrow's question.
Thing 1 tonight, President Trump's followers fighting for his attention.
You have the leaks where people want to love me, and they're all fighting for love. Actually, I'm somewhat honored by them.
But the battle for the president's love extends beyond the White House. In the race for Alabama Senate, one candidate has said God put Donald Trump in the White House, while two others have released fawning ads with titles like Support Trump and Trump Man.
Others attack our president. I'm fighting with him.
I wrote a $2,500 check to help President Trump beat Hillary. And in Congress, I vote with President Trump 95% of the time.
I'll fight for President Trump's agenda every day.
I support President Trump's America First agenda.
As we reported earlier this week, it was Luther Strange who won the rose from President Trump. His campaign nodded to it in this new ad. In the first poll since that endorsement, Strange's competitor, Roy Moore, actually increased his lead. But it's the other candidate, Mo Brooks, who's having an especially hard time with the Trump endorsement and accepting the fact that he's just not that into you. That's Thing 2 in 60 seconds. Served on the House Judiciary Committee during Watergate. Republican strategist Susan Del Percio. Erin Gloria Ryan, she's senior editor at the Daily Beast, and MSNBC contributor Sam Seder, host of The Majority Report with Sam Seder. Well, two things about that response to Putin. One is he does this a lot where he says he's joking. You know, Russia, if you're listening, please hack Hillary Clinton's emails. And two, it's just also clear if he was joking, Susan, like what actually is the response?
Yeah, and it's often with his jokes disturbing because let's not forget there are the staff that work there that in the Russian embassy that now do not have jobs, and they are targeted, in fact, by their government. So they are pariahs now, and they're out on the street. They're not getting another job so quickly. Then you have the staff there who have now been sent home. These are families. These are uprooting families. So as much as it's easy to look at this and say, oh, look, is he joking? Is he not joking? It's really significant when you look at one of the places where we do want to have people on the ground and hearing what's going on, that we end up saying, oh, it's great, we cut our payroll. It's just it's a joke, but it's pathetic.
He also said this thing tonight about Venezuela that we played it in the A block and we haven't talked about it, just out of nowhere. And sometimes you could lead the president to saying things if you walk him up to it. But this was just like, what are the options? And he just, out of nowhere, well, there's a military option and, we're close. And I guess at this point I'm like, what should we make of the president's words in just a broad sense? Like, should we take that seriously? Should we take seriously when he says that?
Well, it's not so much what we do, it's what the rest of the world does, is whether or not we should take it seriously. I mean, obviously there's a sense within the White House and throughout our government that this guy's just going to say anything at any time, and we're going to put out a series of fires, but we should take it seriously insofar as he can act on these things. And I think to a certain extent, I'm not convinced that's not part of the point. I mean, there was a lot of stuff that happened at the beginning of the week. It feels like a long time ago with Manafort. And right. I don't know that he, in his mind, calculates, I'm going to distract people. I think it's as much he's trying to distract himself on some level.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, there's a couple things going on here. First of all, there's no, if there is an I'm just kidding clause in international diplomacy, I was never informed of it, and I think that most people who are dealing in international diplomacy were not informed of the I'm just kidding clause. Right. Second thing, going back to what you were saying, Sam, about what happened earlier this week, like I was saying before we went on air, like if I was given a history test about what happened on Monday, I would fail. Like, so many things are happening all the time. It's not clear that Donald Trump is capable of remembering them as they're happening.
Right, that's the other question, whether he's actually...
Right, much less several days later when they need to be brought up again.
But then there's this deep question that Sam brings up about, like, is this intentional or not? What's your read on that?
It could very well be. I mean, Trump's numbers have been going way down. I mean, a couple of things that we need to keep in background. Yeah. His numbers have been going way down. The investigation against him is going way up, accelerating. More people are being hired. FBI breaks into his campaign manager's office. He said, it's tough stuff. I mean, it hit him because it's not only Manafort, it's Donald Jr. And it's Jared Kushner.
That point
and it could be the president
That
himself.
point about it him, we don't have the tape pulled, but the moment when he says tough stuff, there is a look of genuine dread in his eyes, 100%.
He's panicked about it. I also want to say one thing about Putin. It's not just that it's a joke. We don't have it's a joke in our vocabulary for international relations. But when was the last time he ever said anything critical about Putin? I mean, he cannot
It is
bring
the
himself
darndest thing
to say anything critical about him, and that's just amazing.
Well, this could be all one big joke, where then afterwards he'll be like, I was just kidding every time I didn't say something critical about him.
It's not a joke, though. I think it could really all go back to this Russian investigation and his connections.
And your point, there's a time in your Times piece about the fact that it really is the case. I mean, this is someone who will feud with anyone. He's feuding with Mitch McConnell. He'll feud with Jeff Sessions. I mean, he
doesn't know how to govern.
Wait, but I want to stay on this point. What is your theory? How do you interpret the fact this is a person who will fight with everyone from Rosie O'Donnell to his Attorney General, the Majority Leader, and will never say a bad thing about Vladimir Putin? Not once will he ever.
It's bizarre. There's no explaining it. There's no defending it. There's no rationale to it. It is the way he is, and it's something that is going to continue to be a problem for him. And we'll talk about it like this, but none of us are going to come up with an answer unless we can sit down with a shrink. I mean, let's.
It is, but maybe it's
shrink.
She's saying it's not a shrink.
I'm saying that there may be a real reason, which is his connection with Putin and Russia.
It is very clear. I mean, the one thing that is clear in the available entered evidence is that he just won't. He will not say. I mean, even the joking part is a way for him to say a thing because he has to say a thing, but not actually say the thing which the U.S. government would normally say, which is, this was a bad decision.
Well, in that clip you just played, he just handed it off to Tillerson. He will not articulate it. It may be daddy issues. It may be because there is some videotape out there. We will never know, but I mean, it could be.
I think he's like Schrodinger's jerk. Like, he's both a jerk and not a jerk because he said, I'm just kidding.
Exactly.
And, you know, going back to what you're saying about Donald Trump not being able to govern, I think what's really interesting is that he came in as like an outsider, but now it's clear that Donald Trump is an outsider to government. Like, I'm an outsider to heart surgery in that I don't know
and he's an outsider to his own government, which is actually something that's developed, and we're going to talk about that.
You're Senate Majority Leader McConnell in the last day or so. What do you make of that? And if you reached out,
I don't make anything of it. We should have had health care approved. He should have known that he had a couple of votes that turned on him, and that should have been very easy to handle, whether it's through the fact that you take away a committee chairmanship or do whatever you have to do. But what happened, in my opinion, last week is unacceptable.
President Trump once again tonight complaining about Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell's inability to get health care reforms through the Senate. Still with me, Elizabeth Holtzman, Susan Del Percio, Erin Gloria Ryan, and Sam Cedar. Susan, a bunch of senators today tweeting their support of Mitch McConnell, which seemed their slightly veiled way of supporting him. What do you make of this back and forth?
Well, it's interesting because it's the same senators, for the most part, that said don't go after former Senator Sessions when Trump was talking about potentially firing him, or people around the president were talking about firing him. This is a really weird battle. Now, granted, Mitch McConnell said something in his district, and the president felt the need to respond. And the president isn't 100% wrong here. And you know I'm not a big defender of him, but the fact is that Republicans were talking about this for 7 years. They offered no plan. The president is right when he says they should have been able to do something and get it through. However, the president also said health care is easy and I alone can negotiate. And that's where the wheels kind of fall off of his argument, and to pick this fight with the most important ally you can have. He can't go. This is no longer a populist president in the ways people are talking. Oh, maybe he's more independent because he's throwing away both parties. An independent would be working with both parties, not trying to isolate both parties. That's the difference.
I don't think it's real. I just don't think any part of it is meaningful. I mean, if Mitch McConnell wanted to engage in this fight, he could say, you know what also would have helped? If you didn't take the 51st vote and say that guy wasn't a hero. I mean,
it's a fair point.
I mean, if Mitch McConnell wanted to turn this back on Donald Trump, he could. Donald Trump is just doing what he does in every situation, which is, I'm going to create a conflict. I mean, it's analogous to what's going on.
Republicans should have been able to do something.
But the other thing is that he doesn't.
That's a problem, but that problem would have existed regardless of who was president. I mean, the only thing that Donald Trump probably did, if there's anything that Donald Trump impacted this, it was that he kept the Democratic caucus tight.
But you know what? The fact is that if it was any other Republican president, they would not have had the problems that they had, especially, I mean, calling their own bill mean.
So in some ways I disagree, because I think ultimately, I think the problem was structural. and it preceded Donald Trump. What didn't help was that Donald Trump, the way they did it was he didn't sell it at all, right? Because he couldn't sell it because, as you see from these press conferences, because it was unsellable.
He had no plan. Donald Trump
right.
had no plan, and he never understood the Republicans' plan, so he couldn't sell it. He couldn't talk about it. He couldn't negotiate about it.
It's not just that, though. It's not just healthcare. I've noticed in these press conferences, he cannot stay on the same topic for more than 3 sentences. It is really a bright blinking light to me.
But I also think that he is not accustomed to people writing down what he was saying and then going back to things that he said a couple weeks before. Like when you're a real estate developer and you're dealing with hype, when you're a brand and you're dealing with hype, or you're a EP on a network TV show and you're dealing with next week on this, that's all you have to know. But Donald Trump is just, all he's concerned with is what just happened and what's going to happen in the next 5 seconds.
And he also is only used to, quote, making a deal with somebody, typically in real estate or television, where you can make a deal, you can get into a big argument, but if you can also down the road, a year from now, partner up with somebody else.
Which is also true in politics.
Well, but
look at Rick Perry serving as cabinet.
He doesn't understand how all of a sudden people won't switch back. He's like, oh, well, we just talked about healthcare. Why can't you get on the bandwagon with my infrastructure program?
I think that this is the best place for Mitch McConnell to be, because they're going to find out which. He doesn't care, but no, he wants to be in a position where they can cut either way. Whatever happens in 2018, whatever happens with Donald Trump. I mean, they want flexibility, so nobody wants to be tied to Donald Trump, and they're going to do what's in their interest. Look, Grover Norquist said it. All we need is a hand to sign the things, and it turns out wrong. You also need some ideas and something for them to sign.
But there's also, just to button up this idea, there's also something about him that I increasingly think the president is most comfortable as a commentator on his own presidency. That he actually, the thing that he likes the most is saying stuff and watching the coverage, sitting there watching cable news, tweeting about it, as opposed to presidenting. And so,
and then talking about himself in third person.
So when he talks about McConnell, he's just playing the role he likes best is playing the role of essentially a cable news pundit, as opposed to the guy who's actually doing things.
But I also think, like, when it comes to punditry, like there's a element of that is kind of like sport too. You know, like he watches it, he talks about it like an ESPN commentator talks about it instead of something
with no stakes.
But it's not even punditry. He doesn't really even understand the issues. This is the most superficial.
Well, I've seen some pundits.
Yeah, well, okay, but some understand. Present company.
Obviously.
But seriously, he doesn't understand one of the most superficial part of this. So that's what he's dealing with. I think the point you made is really important. How much can he even absorb? How much is he even interested in absorbing? He just wants to deal with the fighting, with the words, with being a provocateur, with getting more media coverage. That's what excites him.
He still goes out there and talks about the votes he got in Wisconsin. It's
even when he's talking about North Korea. I mean, and I guess my question is: do you end up when we come back in the fall? Is there this idea where everyone just says people in his own government, outside the government, in Congress, just all agree that, like, let's treat him the way let's act as if the president is actually a cable news pundit. Like, he's just a guy saying stuff, and we'll go about doing what we're doing. I think that's what we're headed towards.
At the end of the day, he just wants to sign something. He doesn't care what the health care legislation looks like, or the tax bill, or the tax bill. Exactly. So if they can get something, if they can actually get some work,
just don't listen to him. Do whatever you want to do.
Exactly. But can he even read it? And another question is, what kind of briefings are they giving him?
I have no idea.
I mean, that's a serious question.
Graphics in his Twitter mentions.
And cable news chyrons.
But he gets a reel. He gets a reel every morning of his greatest hits.
How much? I mean, the last thing it seems to me that the Republican Party took, basically Trump dictated to them, was that we're going to do repeal and replace. It may be a week, it may be today, it may be a moment afterwards. And that was back in like early February, I think. And after that, you know, it's really, I don't think they're listening to him anyway.
Exactly. The big test when they come back is whether they listen to that, because he's been very clear about it. Elizabeth Holtzman, Susan Del Percio, Erin Gloria Ryan, and Sam Cedar, many thanks to all of you for being here. That is all in for this evening on this Friday night. Rachel Maddow show starts right now. It's good to have you back, Rachel.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks, my friend. Appreciate it. Have a great weekend.
Guam, there's going to be big trouble.
The president keeps provoking.
And what I said is what I mean.
And provoking.
Those words are very, very easy to understand.
And provoking.
This man will not get away with what he's doing, believe me.
Tonight, amid new hopes of a back channel,
hopefully it'll all work out.
The president defends his unrelenting rhetoric.
If somebody else uttered the exact same words that I uttered, they'd say, what a great statement, what a wonderful statement.
Then, Donald Trump Jr. and the bizarre conspiracy theory at the center of a National Security Council controversy. Plus, new Washington Post reporting on how the Trump D.C. hotel is printing money without filling up its rooms. And the White House wants you to know the president was kidding when he thanked Vladimir Putin.
I want to thank him because we're trying to cut down on payroll.
When All In starts right now.
Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. The President of the United States cannot stop talking off the cuff about North Korea and its nuclear program, repeatedly escalating a grave situation that everyone else outside of the North Korean government wants to calm down. And it's raising new questions about his fitness for the office. After starting the day with a tweet warning the U.S. military is locked and loaded, the president holed up at his New Jersey golf club, sounded off twice today about North Korea, which has been developing nuclear weapons possibly capable of reaching the U.S.
It is a very bad situation. It's a very dangerous situation. We will see what happens. We think that lots of good things could happen, and we could also have a bad solution. But we think lots of good things can happen.
What would be a bad solution, sir?
I think you know the answer to that. We want to talk about a country that has misbehaved for many, many years, decades actually, through numerous administrations. We'll either be very, very successful quickly, or we're going to be very, very successful in a different way quickly.
That makes 4 times in just the last 2 days. The president has taken numerous questions from the press, giving unscripted answers on North Korea and a wide range of other subjects. If the rising nuclear tensions weren't enough, today the president threw out the possibility of military action against Venezuela.
Can you tell us what you're considering for Venezuela? What options are on the table right now to deal with this mess?
We have many options for Venezuela. And by the way, I'm not going to rule out a military option. We have many options for Venezuela. This is our neighbor.
That would be a U.S.-led military operation?
We don't talk about it, but a military operation, a military option is certainly something that we could pursue.
It's not clear if the president made up that option on the spot or if it was something he discussed with his national security team, whom he'd just been meeting with. You see them there standing next to him. For good measure, the president also accused Iran of failing to hold up its end of the international nuclear deal, despite the U.S. government already having certified its compliance since Trump became president. On North Korea, the president declined to clarify whether he's taken any new steps to mobilize the U.S. military. This after he tweeted first thing this morning, military solutions are now fully in place, locked and loaded, should North Korea act unwisely. Hopefully, Kim Jong-un will find another path. It appears that, so far, any escalation has been strictly rhetorical, but the words of the American president typically have consequences. After he threatened earlier this week to rain down, quote, fire and fury on North Korea, North Korean government responded by announcing specific new plans to attack Guam, a tiny U.S. territory in the South Pacific. While the governor of Guam has told residents they're in no heightened danger, today his government issued emergency guidelines for responding to an imminent missile threat, which lays out how to avoid radioactive fallout and warns do not look at the flash or fireball. It can blind you. Still, there was one significant bit of good news today on the North Korea standoff. Associated Press reporting the U.S. has been in regular contact with North Korea through a diplomatic back channel. While it was previously known the U.S. envoy for North Korea policy, career diplomat, had been in talks with the regime about securing the release of American captives, this is the first indication those talks have addressed the broader relationship between the two governments. It remains to be seen if those efforts can withstand a wild-card president who continues to take verbal shots at North Korea's leader.
This man will not get away with what he's doing, believe me. And if he utters one threat in the form of an overt threat, which, by the way, he has been uttering for years, and his family has been uttering for years, or if he does anything with respect to Guam or any place else that's an American territory or an American ally, he will truly regret it, and he will regret it fast.
Earlier this week, Congressman Joaquin Castro described the president's threats to North Korea as reckless. He joins me live from Texas. Do you think the president is helping the situation, Congressman?
No, not at all. All of these inflammatory statements, I think, have just made the situation worse and really have given the United States and Guam and our allies high blood pressure and caused a lot of anxiety. It really makes people feel like we're living in the 1950s or 60s again when that generation was going through the Cold War. So I'm hoping that tomorrow, because it's the weekend, the president will take a day off from Twitter and from press conferences and let everything calm down a bit.
Would it be better for the leadership of the country if the president just didn't address this at all?
I think it would for a while. I think that he should allow both the military to be prepared, of course, but also for the State Department and Rex Tillerson to allow their diplomats to do their work. I hope that there is a back channel of communication that is set up so that this thing doesn't escalate more.
The president today said that his belief was that the allies in Japan and South Korea, which of course would bear the worst brunt of any military activity, that they loved what he was doing, that they were happy about it, they never felt safer. Do you believe that's true?
I don't, and honestly, I don't think that he has his pulse on what the leaders or what the people of South Korea or Japan are thinking, and really has not demonstrated any effort in trying to understand what they're thinking. I mean, remember, last week, this administration accomplished something significant. They got the United Nations to put on North Korea the toughest sanctions that that country has ever seen. That's something that the administration can be proud of, that they achieved, and it's something that they should try to leverage on North Korea. But instead of doing that, every day he's either having a press conference where his statements get more inflammatory or going on Twitter to continue baiting Kim Jong-un.
Has the president's behavior and statements on this particular issue changed your assessment of his fitness for office?
You know, I think myself and many others would prefer somebody else be sitting in the Oval Office making these decisions with the nuclear codes. But Donald Trump was elected president of the United States by the American people last November, and we have to respect that. That said, I'd feel much more comfortable if it was another Republican even who was in this position.
Is there anything Congress can do as you watch this happen? I mean, obviously the president has the nuclear codes, and it's been the case since the 1940s. The president essentially has a unilateral ability to do that. He has a unilateral ability in practice to essentially order U.S. troops anywhere in the world. Do you think there's any reassessment happening in Congress of your role?
I think so. Now, remember, this is a Congress that for years has shirked its responsibility of drafting up a new AUMF, for example. So it very much has been a spectator to this kind of decision making. But, you know, some of my colleagues today were saying that Paul Ryan should call the House back in session. Congress should have an active role in this discussion, most certainly because many folks don't trust the decision making of the president. That means that others in government, including the legislative bodies, have to step in and take on a larger decision-making role.
Finally, would any military action in Venezuela, as the president floated as a possibility today, would that be constitutional? Does he have the authority under current authorization to do that?
Well, the War Powers Act, if we were going to be attacked, would give him the power to do that. But remember, in Venezuela, this is a place where we've not tried intense diplomacy even. And so I think my sense is that President Trump made that comment on the fly. I don't know how serious or not serious he was about it. But, you know, before you even talk about any kind of military action, we have to try diplomacy here.
All right, Congressman Joaquin Castro, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm joined now by someone who knows all too well the challenges of dealing with a nuclear North Korea, Vice President Joe Biden's former national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, who also served senior policy advisor to Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign. And Jake, I want to play a little clip here, warnings about this exact thing, which were a pretty constant feature of the Clinton campaign. Take a listen.
I find it ironic that he's raising nuclear weapons. This is a person who has been very cavalier, even casual, about the use of nuclear weapons. He's advocated more countries getting them, Japan, Korea, even Saudi Arabia. He said, well, if we have them, why don't we use them, which I think is terrifying.
Ronald Reagan said something really interesting about nuclear proliferation back in the 1980s. He said the problem with nuclear proliferation is that some fool or maniac could trigger a catastrophic event. And I think that's who Governor Pence's running mate is, exactly who President Reagan warned us about.
Senator. Is it worse or better or about what you expected?
I'm sorry to say that it's about what we expected. One other thing that Secretary Clinton memorably said last year was that a man you can bait with a tweet is not a man who should be in control of our nuclear arsenal. And look at what we're dealing with now. What Donald Trump is saying is that if Kim Jong-un taunts him, says things, uses words, that he would contemplate using military force like the world has never seen against North Korea. So this is a very dangerous situation, and it has the possibility of spiraling out of control. And what Donald Trump is doing with his words right now, having a race with Kim Jong-un to see who could be more reckless and bombastic, is not strengthening America, it's weakening our national security.
How tenable would it be to arrive at an equilibrium which everyone essentially just agrees to not take the president seriously? So foreign leaders and foreign diplomats understand the president's just going to say things, they don't really mean anything. Internal members of the U.S. government, the Foreign Service, people in the Department of Defense, you've already seen that, say, on the transgender military ban. I mean, is that sort of where we're headed?
Well, those are two different questions. It's not tenable, but it is where we're headed. It's not tenable because the President of the United States, the leader of the free world, the commander-in-chief of the most powerful military in the world and the largest economy in the world, has got to have the credibility to be able to speak on behalf of the United States on matters of national security. And if he loses that credibility entirely, and Donald Trump has come dangerously close to doing that if he hasn't already, then we are in a worse position as a country. Unfortunately, I do think that both members of his national security team and foreign leaders are discounting what he has to say. And the problem when you're dealing with a crisis like we're facing with North Korea is that if you can't be calm and consistent, if you raise doubts, if you create fears, and you're dealing with a paranoid regime like the one led by Kim Jong-un, you can end up in a war by accident, by stumbling into it. And so I don't think it's tenable, but I do think it's where we're headed.
I want to offer a version of a defense of the Trump administration's foreign policy and get your response to it, which is that, of course, his style has been different. He's much more bombastic. He tweets, he does all these things, but on a whole variety of things, he, against his will, but signed the big sanctions packages. They got the 15-0 sanctions against North Korea. They bombed the airstrip in Syria, which Hillary Clinton said she would have done as well. That there haven't been really significant deviations in the actual actions taken by the administration on foreign policy.
Well, first on North Korea, I do extend my sympathy to the administration. If Hillary Clinton were president instead, she'd be facing the same lousy options that Donald Trump is facing. And she and her national security team would be struggling with the same difficult circumstances. Right. And this is not an easy thing. We've had multiple administrations, Democratic and Republican, that have not been able to stop North Korea's march. So I don't think we should be too quick to criticize the totality of the policy. And you're right that the sanctions vote at the UN Security Council was a significant step forward. But there's a difference between that, between saying, you know what, they're trying hard, they're taking some good steps, they're looking at all of their options, and crediting Donald Trump for, in a sense, pouring gasoline on top of this fire and making the crisis even worse. More broadly, I don't think that the Trump administration has hewed to the line that the Obama administration was on, and in many cases that Hillary Clinton would have continued. He pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement. He is now making active noises about pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal. He has loosened the rules of engagement so that there are substantially more civilian casualties on the ground in the Middle East. He's flirted with the possibility of restoring torture. So I think on any number of issues, he is doing things that are detrimental to both the interests and values of the United States.
All right, Jake Sullivan, thank you for your time tonight. Come back again soon, okay? Next, the paranoia fueled into a nuclear war. We're learning more about the worldview of some of the people who staff his government at the very highest levels. And it is not reassuring. Foreign Policy magazine published a memo entitled POTUS and Political Warfare, written by a now former National Security Council staffer named Rich Higgins, who says things like this.
Anybody who's spent time in the Middle East will recognize this. Critical thinking and reason do not exist in the Middle East as we understand them here.
Higgins' NSC memo reflects not the sober analysis you might expect from someone tasked with defending the country, but rather the sort of paranoid worldview of a conspiracy theorist. He weaves together a vast array of alleged enemies of the president that he calls cultural Marxists, a group that includes deep state actors, globalists, bankers, Islamists, and establishment Republicans who are engaged in political warfare to destroy both the president and the nation as we know it. The memo, somewhat reassuringly, got Higgins fired after it was discovered by National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, who had reportedly been trying to root out whoever it was leaking to an anti-McMaster alt-right blogger and Pizzagate conspiracy theorist. But before Higgins was dismissed, his memo made its way to Donald Trump Jr., who, Foreign Policy magazine reported, gave it to his dad. The president, and I quote the reporting here, who gushed over it, according to sources. Trump later learned from Sean Hannity, the Fox News host and close friend of the president, the memo's author had been fired. Trump was furious, the senior administration official said. He is still furious. Joshua Green has been covering the feud between McMaster and Steve Bannon for Bloomberg Businessweek as author of Devil's Bargain, Steve Bannon, Donald Trump, and the Storming of the Presidency. This memo is really, really something else. Did it surprise you when you read it?
Yeah, it did. You know, I read it 3 times, and my conclusion is that this is the product of a mind more fevered than Steve Bannon's. It is just bizarre and batty and disjointed. And while it does reflect, it does kind of hit some of the notes that I know Bannon believes in, the idea that the deep state and the media and the political establishments in both parties are trying to undermine or contain Donald Trump. It's just so weird and rambling that it doesn't really reflect the way that Bannon thinks and speaks. He has a lot of vices, but he's actually a very cogent thinker and writer. So it didn't sound like something that was the product of him.
And yet he is ensnared. I mean, the reason that he's sort of relevant here is this what appears to be this proxy war that's happening over the National Security Council with Bannon on one side and McMaster on the other. What is your understanding from your reporting about what is going on there?
Well, I mean, basically Bannon and McMaster represent 2 different factions in American foreign policy, and Bannon and the nationalists around him favor a less interventionist foreign policy with a focus on combating radical Islam in China, and McMaster is more of a traditional hawkish foreign policy guy who wants to be more aggressive in places like Syria and Afghanistan and North Korea. And the reason it's such a bitter ideological dispute, I think, is that Bannon feels like McMaster represents what the nationalist faction calls the war party. And so on every issue that's come up before the administration, whether a foreign policy issue, whether it's Afghanistan or Syria or now North Korea, they just have distinctly different viewpoints. And Bannon is not a guy who likes to kind of fall back and defer to other people. And even though he's been kicked off the National Security Council, he obviously still has a voice in the administration's foreign policy and is trying to exert his influence through other channels.
We should be clear that to the extent there's a war party, the other side, the Bannon side, for instance, on Afghanistan, wants to essentially outsource the conflict to 5,000 mercenaries by Eric Prince. So it's not exactly like there's like a big peace faction on the other side.
Yeah, I mean, Bannon's view, to the extent that I understand it, is that he wants U.S. troops out of Afghanistan. He wants to wind down the U.S. military